great to be here this evening. Certainly proud to be here as the only dog in the race. I graduated here in '97, also first dated and married my wife here, so over 20 years ago. Unfortunately, it's been a while. But it's good to be here. I'm a sixth-generation Georgian. I am a pro-life, free-market Christian conservative. I am a product of Gainesville, Georgia, the poultry capital of the world. I'm also proud to be the mayor of Alpharetta, the technology city of the South. And I'm also excited to be a candidate for Georgia Secretary of State in what I consider the most irresistible state in these United States. You're going to have some choices when it comes to the Secretary of State's office. There's four great guys standing or sitting actually right here. But in doing that, you're going to need to know where the differences are, where the differences lie. And of the candidates that are here, I'm the only one that has run both a government and a business. I'm the only one that has accomplished goals that are beyond the resources and the authority of my office. I'm the only one that has a record of executive accomplishments in Alpharetta. And those accomplishments include championing tax relief. It includes reinventing our downtown. It includes leading from a mud hole, 85 acres worth, to what is now called Avalon. It involves creating the state's first technology commission. It involves leading leaders to create a technology incubator that now has up to 50 technology companies, about leading leaders to bring a technical college to our city, a conference center to our city, and also now leading leaders to bring over 640 technology companies and adding over 12,000 new technology jobs to the city of Alpharetta over the last 5 years. I'm also the only one who is going to be ready day one to lead an under-resourced, hat-in-hand agency to be the Secretary of State's office to make a better Georgia for all Georgians. Thank you.
State Representative Buzz Brockway.
Great. Thank you, Tim. Thank you for hosting this event, and thank you to the UGA College Republicans for hosting this, and for all of you for being here tonight. I might as well get it out of the way right off the bat here. Saturdays in Athens have not been very kind to me over the years. I'm a 1990 graduate of the Georgia Institute of Technology, and I told Mayor Belle Isle, I don't own anything in my wardrobe that's as red as that. But it is an honor to be here tonight, and for the last 21 years, I have been working in the Republican Party, worked my way up from a grassroots organizer to be chairman of the Gwinnett Republican Party from 2002 to 2005. For the last 8 years now, I've served in the State House, and you compare my voting record, and you look at my voting record, and you'll find that I'm among the most conservative members of the House. I'm pro-life, I'm pro-Second Amendment, I'm pro-Constitution, and the issues that we're going to be talking about tonight as relates to the Office of Secretary of State are very, very important. There are very crucial issues that we're dealing with here tonight. Elections, obviously the Secretary of State runs elections. We're at a crossroads. Well, we have large groups of people in this country who do not trust the results of the election no matter who wins. That's a big problem. Professional licensing. We've gone from an economy where 5% of people required a professional license to now close to 25 to 30% of people require a professional license. That's an issue that must be dealt with. And so what you need in this office, and you already know I went to Georgia Tech, you need somebody in this office who is a kind of a nerd and is going to sit there and think about how do we make lines on election day shorter? How do we process business applications faster? How do we help people find the bottlenecks and get bottlenecks out of the system so people can get professional licenses quicker? So I look forward as the evening goes on to talking about these and many other important issues. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Senator Josh McCoon.
Well, good evening. I want to thank Ethan and his team with the College Republicans and Tim for putting this together. Just to tell you a little bit about myself and why I hope to be your next Secretary of State. My family moved to Columbus, Georgia because my great-grandfather had a job opportunity to work at the Eagle and Phoenix textile mill in downtown Columbus. He worked there for 50 years. My grandfather dropped out of school in the 8th grade during the Great Depression to help take care of our family. He left town when World War II began, enlisted in the Army, fought in the Pacific, came home, married my grandmother who worked at commercial printers in Columbus, worked as a milkman and a railroad conductor. Eventually they opened a little grocery store at 5th Avenue and 8th Street in downtown Columbus. My dad was the first member of our family to go to college. He went to Auburn, and He went on to law school, has practiced law for the last 40 years, and I followed in his footsteps. Went to Furman University for my undergrad, and yes, the University of Alabama for law school. John Barrow, the Democrat in this race, called me out on Twitter the night of the national championship game about that. And I told him that I pulled for Georgia. I've been pulling for Georgia for years, and I didn't even have to ask Nancy Pelosi permission. I haven't heard back from Mr. Barrow since then. But why do I want to run for Secretary of State? Because I want Georgia to be the fastest state in the nation to get a job and the toughest state in the nation to cast an illegal vote. It's just that simple. And as you consider tonight, hear what we are having to say, I think there are two questions you need to answer. Number one, who do you want on that debate stage with John Barrow in October when voters are deciding what could be the most hotly contested race on the general election ballot? And the second question is, who do you want to be Secretary of State in November of 2020 when Donald J. Trump is on the ballot for re-election and the far left is filing lawsuits, spending all kinds of money to mess with our electoral process? You want somebody who's practiced election law and who has proven over the last 7 years he will not be moved by pressure from the left or from the media. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator. And State Representative from Johns Creek, Brad Raffensperger.
Good evening. My name is Brad Raffensperger, and I'm running for Secretary of State to make sure that only American citizens vote in our elections, to make sure that Georgia is a great place to find a job, but also a great place to build a business. If you look at my elected legislative record, both at the city council level and also at the state level, I've always worked to protect taxpayers, business owners, life, and the Second Amendment. Trish and I met in high school, and we've been married for 41 years, and that doesn't happen too often. But we built a great life, and we built it here in Georgia. And this is where we raised our kids, and this is where our grandkids are right now, and we've been really blessed. Somewhere along the line, I decided I wanted to start my own business, so ended up with a manufacturing facility down in Columbus, Georgia, and I've been down there since 1988. And last year, before Trump was elected, I put another plant in up in Forsyth County. And from these two manufacturing plants, we employ nearly 200 people now. And we do work in over 35 different states. And because I've worked in those 35 different states, I've seen how some states make it easy to do business and other states make it hard to do business. And as your next Secretary of State, I'm going to make sure it's easy to do business in the state of Georgia. That's really important. I don't know if it's because my dad's a World War II veteran, he passed away. I don't know why, he was a strong patriot. I don't know if it's because, actually I didn't tell you, my dad got transferred up to Canada and I lived outside this country a few years. But I just really feel strongly that the only people that should be voting in our elections are American citizens. And I'm going to fight to defend that. There's two things I don't think you should ever devalue, and that's your currency and that's your citizenship. And I just feel strongly about that. So I'm going to work hard as your next Secretary of State. I am an engineer. I'm registered in 30 states. I'm good with technology. The reason I'm running is to make sure only American citizens vote in our elections, to make sure this is a great place to find a job, but also a great place to build a business. My name is Brad Raffensperger, longest name on the ballot. Thank you.
Thank you. You know, I noted that I believe we heard from Georgia, Georgia Tech, Alabama, Auburn. Please tell me you didn't go to Florida or Tennessee.
No, my undergraduate in engineering was from Western University in Ontario. Trish and I met in high school, and that's why I went to school up there. And I moved back to the States and started my MBA at Virginia Tech, got transferred here in 82 and finished up at Georgia State University. So I know that doesn't meet the UGA cred here, but hopefully y'all will forgive me.
Let's go ahead and we'll start the questioning with you. And again, 1 minute for each of you to answer. Should one of you call out the other for any reason, that person will get a period of time to respond. Each of you, in some way or another, referenced the integrity of the ballot, making sure only American citizens vote, only citizens of Georgia vote in elections in Georgia. Representative Raffensperger, to you. Two parts to the question here. How crucial or how extensive do you think the problem is now, and what do we do about it?
Well, it would be tough to know if there is a problem if you don't know there's a problem. It's something that's never really been quantified. But really, I want to get in front of that to make sure that we don't have an issue. So last year we had a bill in the House that would put on the word non-citizen on driver's license. This year there's another bill proposed to flip the license for non-citizens when they have driver's license. It's really just to be a gatekeeper. there's just whatever we can do to make sure that non-citizens aren't getting access to a ballot is very important.
Senator McCoon, the same questions. Do we have some sense of the extent of the problem, and what's your solution for it?
Well, number one, it's hard to know the extent of the problem because we have 2 sworn law enforcement personnel under the Secretary of State's office to handle all the election complaints. And people saying there's not a voter fraud problem, it would kind of be like if we had 2 state troopers for the entire state and we said there wasn't a speeding problem. You know, there's just not the resources to enforce the law. There's several issues that I think we've got to address. We've issued over 48,000 driver's licenses to illegal aliens with deferred action in this state because of the motor voter law. We don't know how many of those people may be on the voter rolls. And because citizenship verification is not allowed due to a federal court decision, that's an issue we're going to have to tackle. That's an issue the next Secretary of State's going to have to tackle. Absentee ballot reform's another issue. You have voter ID on election day and in early voting, but no voter verification of identity in the absentee ballot process. So we need to look at tightening that up, whether it's requiring a notary to go over the absentee ballot application or otherwise. So there are a myriad of weak points where we could be attacked.
Hold the thought, because we're going to circle back through some of what you just mentioned. But quickly, in 1 minute, Representative Brockway, the same set of questions.
Yeah, the way you protect the integrity of the ballot is you protect the voter list. You have to keep that clean, and Georgia does a number of things already to do that. There are many, as I've traveled the state and talked to elections officials, there are many, many outstanding elections officials who work night and day to make sure that our voter lists are clean. Obviously, photo ID that Georgia has here is incredibly important. There's more things we can do to work on that, and you have to find it and prosecute it every chance you get. I'll be honest with you, I am skeptical when people tell me there are massive amounts of voter fraud going on in the state of Georgia. I'm skeptical of that because I know what we do, and I know what we've been doing over the last 10 years or so and to protect the integrity of the ballot. There's always more we can do, and we have to be absolutely vigilant, but we just got to continue to work hard and do the things that we're doing because it's working.
And David Bellal, Mayor Bellal.
Well, you don't have to know how fast the water is leaking out of the bottom of the bucket to know that you need to patch it. So what I want to see, certainly bringing a photo ID to the absentee ballot process is important. Right now, you don't need a photo ID, you don't need a witness, you don't need a notary, you don't need an excuse, and we're championing that. The other thing is right now the Proof of Citizenship Act has not yet been implemented. It was passed in the legislature in 2010. It's time to actually implement that. And then also, I think in terms of going to that next generation machines, I know we'll be talking about that later today, but I will fully support and fully champion a cyber secure, paper verified system. And I think that not only does that create better security, but it also creates better trust from our voters, because it's not just important to have secure voting. Voters need to know and feel confident in that their votes are secure and they are just as they made them.
I think it was Representative Brockway who referenced photo ID. I will ask the question this way. If anybody is opposed to the photo ID requirement, I'll give you 5 minutes to explain why. I don't see any takers. We're all in favor of photo ID requirements in Georgia. Is that correct?
I was trying to work into how I could get the 5 minutes and then.
No. Let's talk about everybody for the record. Everyone, the 4 of you are in favor of the photo ID requirement.
Yes. Absolutely.
Yes. And
the
machine
it
issue.
in some cases.
The machine issue. We'll start with you, Senator McCoon, because as far as I know, you may be the only one with this proposal. The others can weigh in. You have advocated moving, shall we say, backwards in time, away from the touchscreen electronic voting machines. You're not calling for a paper backup. If I understand your proposal correctly, you're calling for paper machines, the old-fashioned machines. First of all, have I accurately stated your position, and if so, why?
Well, what I've said is that we need input from local communities on whatever technology we adopt. I think it could be a big mistake to rush new technology into the process when, frankly, we risk litigation and other issues when implementing new technology. I've been meeting with the folks that support the current system. I believe that it can continue at least through an additional presidential election cycle if necessary. We do need a paper element to our system, whether that is going back to an optical scan ballot which there's been some discussion around, or whether it's going to a hybrid system that combines a touchscreen voting machine with a paper ballot that is produced and run through a scanner. What I think is really, really important is that all the stakeholders are brought to the table, because the Secretary of State doesn't run the election. You have 159 counties doing that.
Buzz Brockway, Representative Brockway.
Yeah, there are 70% of the country votes with machines that use some sort of paper component. So it makes sense for us. And as I travel the state and talk to people, there's a great demand for that. That's a great way we can rebuild trust in our electoral system, is to have that paper component to it. What I would prefer to see is a thoughtful and deliberative process. Let's take some of these machines that are on the market, let's put them in the field and have pilot programs, much like we had, that Secretary Kemp had just recently in the November elections in Conyers, and let's let people try them. Let's put them under the stress of an actual vote and see how they work, and get feedback from the public, and have a conversation with the public on what sort of election system we want. Look, the lack of trust in government hangs by a thread. The idea that we can rush new machines out there, which unfortunately there's a bill in the House now that would require new machines by January 1st, that's too fast. We need to be deliberative about this and be smart about it.
Mayor Bell-Al.
Well, I definitely think, just for the record, going to a paper system would be moving backwards, not just in time, but moving backwards. I believe that the system that we need to go to, and the one that I support and advocate, and I do think we need to do it in due time, but I support a system essentially where you would go to and present your driver's license like you do now. You'd be given a piece of cardstock with a barcode on it as the result of where you live. You would submit that cardstock into a voting machine and vote electronically, just like you do now. And then when you hit cast ballot, it'll print out your vote decision on that ballot. You're able to visually verify that the vote is just as you intended. And then you submit it to a second machine, which makes a scan and a second electronic copy, and also stores and reserves that physical copy. That redundancy is what's going to help build that trust and the security for the people of Georgia.
And Representative Raffensperger.
The voting machines that we have right now were put into service in 2002, 15 to 16 years ago. So they do need to be looked at for updating. The system that was used in City of Conyers was the DS200 system, and that seemed to work very well. The way that system worked, we could try it down at the Capitol. It was electronic on this part, touch screen, just like we have right now. And then when you were done, it printed out a ballot, but you hadn't voted yet. And then you could look at that paper ballot. I got my thumb on it, licked it to see if it would smudge, and it didn't. Then you took it over to the optical scanner, and that's where the vote was actually counted, and it dropped into the box. I'm not saying that's a system that we should use, but that is one of the systems that we probably would consider. I think there's 5 key stakeholders that need to be part of that process, and those would be the House, the Senate, and the governor, because those 3 folks are going to have to vote for the money that it's going to cost to get the new machines. But we want to make sure we bring in the county registrars and the county election supervisors or the probate judges. Thank you very much.
And we'll start with you again, because you referenced some engineering background and some sense of technology. Not that the other folks here would lack it, but since you referenced it, I'll start with you on this. And this is as much for my understanding as anybody who may be listening. We are told and reminded and led to believe from any number of sources, some who purport to be experts, that the touchscreen voting machines, the very machines that we use now in Georgia, some that may be in use in other states, are susceptible to hacking. Now, to my admittedly limited understanding, I look at that voting machine, which is plugged into nothing other than a wall socket, and I think to myself, it's no more susceptible to hacking than my microwave oven might be susceptible to hacking. Am I right? Am I missing something fundamental? How serious is the quote-unquote hacking threat with those electronic voting machines that I'm using on Election Day?
Well, wisely, the voting machines are not connected to the internet. As soon as you connect to the internet, then you are susceptible to hacking. But the other thing you have to be concerned about is actually just the card. If someone brought in an errant card and it was inserted into the machine, then that's how you could actually infect it with a virus. It's no different than if you left a flash card out there on a thumb drive out there somewhere on UGA campus. Someone would pick it up, stick it in their computer, and if it had a virus in it, now it's in the system. And so those are the 2 main considerations you'd have to worry about. We don't really know if there's ever been an issue, obviously, to the point that other folks have made. But the new system that they had tried out seemed to work well and still maintained the segregation and was not connected to the internet. But also gave you a verifiable paper trail, which allows that means you can go back and count and audit.
Representative Brockway, how concerned are you, if at all, of the issue of hacking?
It's always a concern, and listen, the truth of the matter is every voting machine can be hacked. That's just the truth. Every electronic machine can be hacked. So what you have to have around
My microwave oven can be hacked?
Your microwave oven can be hacked. You have to have security measures around that, and one of the things we do currently in Georgia is during their process of verifying the machines before the election, they run a mock election where they know the results. If it matches the known results, then you know that the machine has not been hacked. You do that pre-election, you do that post-election. Another important thing, and this is one thing I applaud Representative Scott Turner for introducing in his bill on elections, is a post-election audit. I come from a manufacturing background. You don't just manufacture a product and then ship it out. You do quality assurance on it to check to make sure that the machines are working accurately. 2 states do that now, and Georgia needs to be the third.
Mayor Bell, concerns about hacking?
I think the way we handle that, both from a security standpoint, which is half the question, and the trust of the public situation, which is the other half of the question, I do think the redundancy, the system I described earlier, requiring 2 electronic copies and a physical copy is the best way on that front. But I do think the bigger issue on hacking is not so much the machine as the database. I mean, that's where all the information is collected and held, and there's been some issues in the past with that. And I think that's where we have to be vigilant. I'm mayor of the technology city of the South, proud to be so. So I certainly understand the importance and the value of technology as we apply this to our voter system.
And Senator McCoon.
And to the extent that I think there's cheating going on in Georgia elections, it's much more likely coming through the paper absentee process than it is coming through the early and in-person voting on touchscreen machines. We had a situation in Muskogee County where a woman tried to vote, brought 19 absentee ballots from residents from a nursing home, did a little investigation, found out 15 of the 19 people couldn't sign their name or make their mark, but somehow they had applied for these absentee ballots and cast them, and spoiler alert, they were not voting for Republicans. But when it comes to the technology itself, I think we have to also consider the public confidence. We had this mayoral race in Atlanta back in December, a margin very similar to a margin 8 years earlier. Ms. Norwood requests a recount. You can't do a recount with an electronic, purely electronic process. You just run that program again. So I think if we want to restore public confidence, we've got to move to a system that involves paper that can be independently verified and audited. That's very important.
All right, again, for the edification of our listening audience, folks who are tuning into WGAU right now, expecting to hear whatever it is we're doing at this hour of the night, you've tuned into a special broadcast. We're at the University of Georgia's Miller Learning Center, and we are here as guests of the University of Georgia's College Republicans for a candidates debate. You're hearing 4 candidates, Republican candidates, for Secretary of State. We're joined by Alpharetta Mayor David Bell Isle, State Representative Buzz Brockway, State Senator Josh McCoon, and State Representative Brad Raffensperger. We are about halfway through the first portion of this debate this evening, in which we pose questions about, one of the 2 major responsibilities of the Secretary of State and the Secretary of State's office, that of administering elections in Georgia. On that front, and we'll start with Representative Buzz Brockway, it's been mentioned by someone, actually a couple of you, I forget now who brought it up, but since they did, I'll bring it up in the form of a question here. I think Senator McCoon just now said one of the avenues, if you will, for tampering with the election process in Georgia deals with that issue of absentee balloting. How serious is that? What's the solution to that?
A couple of my opponents here have mentioned requiring photo ID with obtaining an absentee ballot. There's a few states that do that, Kansas most notably.
And Georgia does not.
Georgia's not, and here's why. Because I drafted a bill last year to do exactly this, and I was advised to go have a chat with the attorney at the Attorney General's office who actually defended our photo ID law in court. And so as I chatted with him, he informed me that one of the things we said as we defended Georgia's photo ID law, which was upheld by the Supreme Court, we said, look, if somebody doesn't have an ID, the state of Georgia will provide one to them for free, which we do, but also that person could vote absentee. And there are other security measures that we do. It's not like absentee voting is just wide open. There are security measures in place. We do two-step verifications on those. But it's an important issue. I think we need to explore it. I held back on that bill because of fear of creating a lawsuit that could put our entire photo ID law at jeopardy. But it's something that we need to look at very diligently.
Senator McCoon.
Well, I want to be clear, I'm not talking about photo ID for absentee ballots. What I am talking about is a notary verifying the identity of the person when they apply for the absentee ballot, which is something that a number of other states have done. It's correct what you've heard, that it would be a litigation risk for us to include photo ID for absentee balloting. We've been sued a number of times. The photo ID law has been upheld. This is one of the reasons that it's very important to have someone with a background in election law who's been in court dealing with election contests and ballot access issues as the next Secretary of State. Because as you formulate this policy, one of the number one considerations has to be, what are these left-wing groups going to do in court to try to knock down common sense reform? So I think the notary requirement is probably the way to go to tighten up that process.
Representative Raffensperger.
I'm not opposed to the notary idea. The challenge I have with it is I don't know how many notaries would be available to be able to do that, particularly for some folks that just wouldn't have access to it. But I do think in lieu of a notary, if you had then two witnesses, having two witnesses almost is biblical in that respect. And then you'd have, three signatures on there, the voter, and two witnesses that would witness that signature.
And Mayor Bell-Al.
I do believe the absentee ballot is the widest door open with respect to election fraud. And there's a concept called vote harvesting. And vote harvesting is essentially, and there's documentation of this in Florida and certainly New Jersey. Florida had the best example of it, or the lightest example of it, I should say. Essentially what they would do is order absentee ballots for an entire street. They would monitor when they arrived and apply high-pressure tactics to get votes for their candidate. New Jersey took it a step further. They did that, but then they also offered dollars and money to be able to fill out those absentee ballots and turn them in. I think that is as much as important as it is to get cybersecurity and other forms of election integrity in place, I think the biggest door that needs to be closed is the absentee ballot, and I fully support a photo ID to the absentee ballot.
You do support a photo ID for that?
Absolutely.
Another avenue, it seems to me, and others have made the same observation, another avenue for election fraud, and one that I would think would be of concern, the voter registration process itself. The registration process itself. Start with you, Senator McCoon. What do we, and the same set of questions, how extensive is the problem to the extent that we may know, and B, what by way of solutions?
Well, I think one of the biggest problems we have in our state is many states have prohibited this notion of paying bounties to people to go out and register folks to vote. That is to say, if I were able to register every person in this room, I'd be paid by the voter as opposed to just paying somebody by the hour to go register voters. We had a situation in Muskogee County where a new Georgia Project volunteer, a far-left organization that's supposed to be registering voters, went to register this young man who was from out of state playing in a travel ball tournament. He told the person, I'm not a Georgia resident. They said, oh, it's no problem. We're going to take care of you anyway. He fills out the paperwork. Of course, it's rejected. But when he goes to vote in what was going to be his first presidential election in November of 2016, he's turned away from the polls. So that's an invitation to fraud, and it's something that we ought to eliminate. That's something I'd like to work with the General Assembly to do, is simply make that practice illegal to pay bounties for people obtaining voter registrations.
Mayor Bell-Al.
Yeah, I would say on the voter registration process, I've mentioned the Proof of Citizenship Act a couple of times this evening. And right now, because it hasn't been implemented, what you can do when you register to vote, Block 5 has 3 options. And as long as you check the option that says I have neither a driver's license or a social security number, and you fill out the rest of the form, you will be added to the voter registration rolls. So one of the most important things that the next Secretary of State office does is to implement that legislation that has now been passed 8 years ago.
Representative Raffensperger.
I think as it relates to registering people, I think it really should be more restricted to where you can actually register folks. If they can go to the post office, they go to the police station, they go to city council, other places. But just to have people going door to door and signing up folks, I don't think that's the appropriate way. It's just rife for abuse.
He didn't answer this. Representative Brockway.
Yeah, I think these gentlemen have mentioned a lot of good ideas. I think one thing that's important to remember, Georgia now has is compliant with the Real ID requirement that Congress passed some years ago. That really does help us lock down who is eligible to vote. But one of the things I think that where a lot of the fraud comes from in voter registration is using paper applications to file a form. Georgia has online voter registration. If you have a driver's license or a state ID, you can register online. That has reduced the paperwork in the Secretary of State's office quite a bit and frees them up to follow up more diligently on those paper applications that we received. Senator McCoon mentioned the New Georgia Project funded by Stacey Abrams. She headed that up, and all sorts of problems arose from that because tens of thousands of applications were sent in. There were paper applications with phony names and that sorts of things. So, incentivizing people to register online would be a great help.
That discussion, obviously, about how to get names on to the voter roll. The issue of getting names off the voter roll arises as a problem from time to time. We've seen examples in other states and occasionally in this state. But the business of purging voters from the rolls for various reasons, inactivity, death, which I suppose is the ultimate inactivity. What do we need to do to safeguard that process while at the same time protect the rights of voters and people's franchise? Mayor Bell-Howe.
I think the biggest thing we can do, and the phrase that we often use and you'll often hear, is list maintenance. And there's a question, obviously, and there on the conservative side of that argument, usually it's more aggressive list maintenance. On the liberal side of that, it's usually no list maintenance at all. What I would propose, and what I think is key, is to the extent that we can legally, that it needs to be consistent and predictable and transparent. And I think what we've seen experienced in the past is that it hasn't been as predictable and cyclical as it should. And so if it is, because a lot of times you're trying to time that around elections, I think it needs to be, if we run it like clockwork, it's a lot harder to argue with if you know exactly when it's going to take place.
Representative Brockway.
Great. Yeah. Most of a lot of the volume that comes in new voter registrations are simply people moving from one address in Georgia to another address in Georgia. And we had a change just recently in the Department of Driver Services. So when you go to obtain your new driver's license at your new address, you opt out rather than opt in. So it automatically updates the voter list. That will reduce the paperwork immensely as far as that goes. Now, list maintenance is critically important. Georgia is part of a consortium of 30 states led by Kansas that compares regularly our voter lists to try to identify if people have moved. We also receive a list from the Postal Service of people who have requested a new address, and we start to follow up with them to see where they really live. There's another entity that I think we need to join. It's called ERIC, and it's an acronym I can't remember. But they do those things, but they also check the Social Security death records. And believe me, the Social Security knows when you pass away immediately, so we should incorporate that too to keep our list clean.
Representative Raffensperger.
I think that list should be updated on a regular basis, either 3 months or 6 months. I think that anything longer is too long. It would be particularly beneficial for the smaller counties. If you just do it every 2 years, it just swamps, the boat on the smaller counties. And then to that point, there's really working with other states, just like for the engineering and general contracting, we have reciprocity with other states. If you get a speeding ticket in North Carolina, they'll find you out down in Georgia and you'll be losing points down here. So I think that we can do that with other sister states, and that's very important. And then obviously death records, and then also Social Security. And change of address with the post office.
I can confirm your point about the speeding tickets in North Carolina. Senator McCoon.
I think that a greater level of interstate cooperation is important where people have moved from one state to another. President Trump's talked about this. That's something that we really need to do in our Secretary of State's office. I also think that we have to do something about the fact that the state has issued over 48,000 driver's licenses to illegal aliens with deferred action. Unfortunately, we're not allowed to verify citizenship because there's a court order from a federal court saying that you cannot do that. So I think what the next Secretary of State could do is take the DDS, the Department of Driver Services limited term driver's license list, compare it with the 159 county lists around the state, and if we find those folks on these lists, they could be purged. The last thing when it comes to death notices, I think some counties are doing a really good job, some counties are not. So the Secretary of State's office needs to be working with boards of elections and with probate judges to make sure those best practices are in place. My local board does a purge every month. Thank you.
And Representative Raffensperger. Or did you answer this?
I answered it.
We're all done with that one. I got one job. I got to just keep track here. I got one job. All right, a couple more questions as they relate to the issue of elections. Again, one of the two major realms of responsibility for the Secretary of State's office, and then we'll segue into the other. There has been some discussion. When people bring it up, it's frequently the people who are critical of it. I don't know where any of you gentlemen are on this, if this is an issue for you at all or a concern for you at all. Start with Senator McCoon. 3 weeks, the early voting window. Too long, not long enough, just right.
Well, I carried the legislation in the Senate to move our early voting window from 45 days, which it used to be, to 21. And I think everybody agreed 45 days was too long. As I've traveled around the state, I think that there are urban counties with boards of elections that say, hey, we like having the 3 weeks. It helps us manage the process a little bit better. I think for rural counties, it's a huge unfunded mandate. I think in terms of mandatory early voting, I think 1 week with a Saturday would be plenty of time. You have 45 days to cast a paper absentee ballot. You have election day, and then you'd have an additional week plus a Saturday. I don't think anyone would have an excuse that they weren't being given an adequate opportunity to vote, but leave the flexibility in place for the larger counties that have that management issue of a large voter population. I think that's probably the right solution.
Representative Raffensperger.
I believe that probably the best solution would be 1 week minimum for all counties, which then helps the smaller counties, and then give the flexibility for the larger counties for 2 weeks. I just think that the 3 week period, if you look at what has happened in the city of Johns Creek, for example, we just get very little turnout, in that 1 week. It just seems like people are getting warmed up. It takes them a week to find out about it. So I think that 2 weeks would work for, my area, and I think that should work fine for the larger counties.
Representative Brockway.
I do think it's too long, but I'm concerned about trying to have different lengths of time in different parts of Georgia. I think that's confusing to voters, and I also think that it should be uniform across the state. So I think we need to have a hard conversation, and we need to do it based on fact. There's several studies that I've read that have shown that early voting has not increased turnout at all. And one study I read even suggested that turnout actually went down because people sort of get in their mind, I have plenty of time to vote, and then the voting day comes and goes and they forget. So I think we need to shorten it. I think it needs to be uniform across the state. We do, as was mentioned, we need to keep in mind what happens in small counties that don't have large staff to sit there and wait for a couple voters to show up who might show up in early voting.
And Mayor Bell-Al.
It is an unfunded mandate, but it's not just a problem for small communities, it's a problem for large communities. As a municipal elected official, we are elected on the odd years, not the even years. And when you have a city council race, when the mayor's not up, it's actually a pretty lowly attended race. I think the city of Alpharetta, we have 65,000 people. I think for our last straight municipal election, we had about 3,000 or under 3,000 people. The county of Fulton charged us over $100,000 to host that election. The early voting was a big component of that. So it's not just a small town problem, it's an every town problem. And I do think it needs to be short. I would say 1 week is certainly sufficient, but 3 is by far too much. I would also echo that the uniformity across the state is important.
Finally, and this will be the last question on this topic. So with that in mind, Cecilia, if we would, let's extend the response time to 2 minutes, if you would. 2 minutes to answer this question, because it's a pretty big question. It just occurred to me as I was listening to your responses there, as is the case with so much of what else we've discussed, the issues of voting machines and possible changes there, much of what we have discussed by way of adjusting our election process deals with matters that have to be addressed legislatively, as opposed to things the Secretary of State might be able to do by himself or herself, as the case may be. With that in mind, and I note that 3 of you are in the legislature. One has yet to suffer that misfortune, but 3 of you are in the legislature. Start with you, Mayor Belle-Isle, as the outlier here. What is something the Secretary of State can do unilaterally by way of improving the election process in any or any number of areas? And again, 2 minutes to answer that one.
Absolutely. Well, let me first start with the Secretary of State's office is a hat-in-hand position. And what I mean by that, it has very few resources. I believe it's under-resourced. I also believe that it has almost zero authority. Now, as a mayor, I know exactly what that feels like. Mayor is a great title, but I can't even pass a budget unless I get 3 other guys on board. And so for the Secretary of State's office to make really meaningful improvements in terms of election security, whether it's licensing, corporations, everything the Secretary of State's office does, now there are some exceptions, but pretty much everything the Secretary of State's office, they're going to need the support of the House at Georgia. They're going to need support of the Senate. They're going to need support of the Lieutenant Governor and the Governor. Oftentimes, to get things done, we're going to need the support of folks outside the government entities. There's a lot, and I'm sure we'll talk about economic things later. There's a lot the Secretary of State's office can do that goes beyond its direct responsibilities. But the opportunity here and the opportunity to improve election security, there is some things you can do efficiency. You can always try to tweak this, run the county boards better, give better advice. There's things that you can do, but in generally speaking, if we're going to make material changes to our election process, you're going to need a leader who knows how to lead leaders and engage people from all over the state of Georgia.
Representative Brockway.
Yeah, I think we have a tremendous resource. We have many, many tremendous resources here in the state of Georgia, but the one I want to focus on now is our local elections officials. These folks have been running elections for years and years and years. They know all sorts of stuff. And as I travel the state, many of them have a lot of opinions about things that they'd like to see changed, things that we currently are authorized to do under Georgia law. So I would start there and working with them to come up with new ideas. And things that we can do right now. But listen, the currency of politics, if you want to be successful in politics, you have to earn the trust of the people in the legislature. And I've done that in my 8 years in the House. I've earned the trust of the people in that legislature, so I can go to them and I can talk to them about the things that we need in the Secretary of State's office. And that's ultimately, I think, how you get this done is through trust. So, I would start with the local election officials and take their ideas and implement what we can implement, working with the State Board of Elections, and get right to work on what we can do immediately.
Senator McCoon.
Well, I definitely think there are issues that will require the legislature to assist in pushing a program forward. That's why I'm proud to have the support of 21 of my colleagues in the state Senate, including Majority Leader Bill Cowsert, who represents the Athens area. As far as what you can do outside of working with the legislature, I think there are a couple of things. What I mentioned earlier about comparing the DDS list of 48,000 driver's license holders who are illegal aliens with deferred action, that doesn't require a bill to pass the legislature. It just requires having the will to do it. I think that going around the state holding seminars in communities where we're seeing high levels of provisional ballots, those are ballots that are given when someone's being turned away from the ballot, to go over the 10 most common reasons people are turned away, to make sure that people are properly educated on that process. I think that there's a tremendous amount of soft power in being a statewide constitutional officer that can be wielded to improve our process. I think working with other secretaries of state around the nation to compare best practices, and as was mentioned earlier, certainly utilizing our resource, all of our boards of elections and elections professionals around the state who have a wealth of experience on how we can do things better. I think those are all things that a Secretary of State, new Secretary of State can do from day one to hit the ground running.
And finally, again, something that the Secretary of State can do unilaterally without any buy-in from the legislature, the governor, anyone else. What steps to improve, enhance the election process might there be, and what steps might you take, Representative Raffensperger?
Well, 2 things that are relatively free. It's communication and training. Just being able to pick up the phone and call someone. I think sometimes we just want to do everything with the internet, and I see that even with my construction business, is that just pick up the phone and call that person human to human. And so I think that's what we need to do is out to actually be talking to other people, engaging with the county election supervisors, engaging with your folks at work, for the Secretary of State's office, and then training, and then retraining and retraining. There's two organizations that really run very tight shops. That's Chick-fil-A and that's Quick Trip. And why is it that they're so good at what they do? I know they hire, some great folks there, but also they train, and they train. And so I think training is something that you can do, and with relatively, small cost that you can do within your budget. And that gets back to, I've done that in my own business. I have about 200 employees, and I understand those are two critical functions, is communicating your message and training and working with your folks.
You might have also mentioned the Waffle House, but that's another discussion for another day. Again, our four candidates for the Secretary of State's office, Republican candidates, that was Representative Brad Raffensperger of Johns Creek, State Senator Josh McCoon, Columbus, State Representative Buzz Brockway, Gwinnett County. Where in Gwinnett? Lawrenceville in Gwinnett County, and Alpharetta Mayor David Bell Isle. We're at the University of Georgia. It's Miller Learning Center as guest of our host this evening, University of Georgia's College Republicans. The second portion of the evening, and we'll go about another half hour here, questions that deal with the other major realm of responsibility for the Secretary of State's office. We've discussed elections for the last half hour or so. We'll conclude the evening by discussing the licensing process, a lot of work with corporations and businesses in Georgia. Mayor Bell Isle, and if I'm getting this wrong, I'll apologize, but I believe it was you've made reference to, I think a couple of times already this evening, what you say is an under-sourced and under-resourced Secretary of State's office, not only in the elections realm, but one would also assume in the licensing area of your responsibilities as well, the Secretary of State's office responsibilities. What do you mean by that? What would you do about it?
Well, the best example is the nursing board. The nursing board and those who are licensed under it represent really half of the licensed professionals in the state of Georgia. Those through those licenses, the state generates actually, I think it's over $4 million. But not all those funds are actually coming back to actually manage that board. And as a consequence, for instance, there is a position called the nurse education consultant. Well, to be a nurse education consultant, which oversees the education and training of new licensee applicants, well, to be able to be qualified for that, it pays $75,000, but to be qualified for it, you would be eligible in the free market to earn a six-figure salary. And so, quite frankly, that position goes unfilled quite a bit of time. And so those are the kinds of things that we need to figure out, not necessarily how to grow the Secretary of State's office, but how to retain more of those funds to do the job that the Secretary of State office is tasked to do by the state constitution.
Representative Brockway.
Yeah, licensing reform is a huge issue. Yes, I do think that the Office of Secretary of State is underfunded. It's been subject to budget cuts for many, many years, and we've restored some of those cuts as the economy's improved. But we need to put more resources into the investigators, because the investigators have to investigate everything that the Secretary of State's office does, from election fraud to professional licensing problems to securities problems and et cetera. So we do need more resources put into that. I think that we need to work with the legislature, and I think that this is where I mentioned relationships are critically important. Go to the legislature and then our next governor with a realistic plan of what exactly does the Secretary of State's office need. It brings in about $80 million through the professional licenses, and it runs the office, the entire office, of about $20 million. We probably need more, so let's figure out what that right number is and work with the legislature and the governor to get that money.
Senator McCoon.
I think, again, there are clearly issues with resources. Talking about nurses, 550 open complaints right now, a fairly small percentage-wise, but a large number of folks. On average, 400 days that's open while the investigation process is going on. That's just wrong. That shouldn't be occurring. I pre-filed a constitutional amendment this year to dedicate licensing fees to the respective boards. I think that's the appropriate way to handle this issue, because then they can determine, we need this many inspectors, this is what it's going to cost. Well, then that's what your renewal fee is going to need to be. That's what your application fee is going to need to be. And I think all of us as Republicans would agree, if you're paying for a service, then it ought to be going to that board. It ought to be going in that direction. And so I don't expect a constitutional amendment will move this year, but we're building a coalition of licensed professions around this state that want to see that happen.
And Representative Raffensperger.
Well, what we've been talking about is right now, if you look at the corporation filing fees and also your licensing, that generates about $80 million of income a year for the Secretary of State's office. Unfortunately, the budget for the Secretary of State's office is $30 million. So the other $50 million goes into the general fund. And so that's why right now you're stretched to be able to do what you need to do budget-wise and to really service folks. I'm a registered engineer and also licensed contractor, and I've been pleased with the service, but I have heard from some boards that haven't felt that they've had that same high-quality service. Some of it is the folks that are actually on the boards. Some of it is legislative, which I'm a legislator. We should probably fix that. And so there's really two issues going on there, but we've heard from the nurses, I think we all have, and that's one of the issues I think that needs probably at the front of the line that needs to be addressed.
The four gentlemen who say they will be candidates for Secretary of State, you're never a candidate for anything until you qualify. Qualifying is in
March 5th through the 9th.
March, what were those dates again?
5th through the 9th.
Through the 9th. These gentlemen say they're going to qualify and run for Secretary of State. The race to replace, as we well know, Brian Kemp, the Secretary of State from here in Athens, who is himself running for governor. State Representatives Buzz Brockway and Brad Raffensperger from Lawrenceville and Johns Creek, respectively. Senator Josh McCoon from Columbus and Alpharetta Mayor David Bell. Al, back to you, Representative Raffensperger. You mentioned you, as a business owner and operator yourself, you have firsthand interactions with some of this process or some of these processes. I typically, when I hear people discuss, whether it's at the local level, the state level, or maybe some degree of federal regulation, as we were just addressing, people generally discuss it wherever the jurisdiction happens to be. They generally discuss it in negative terms. Like, it's really bad in that city over there. It's not quite as bad in this city or state over here. You've done business here and I presume elsewhere. In terms of the licensing climate here, the business climate here, the regulatory climate here, how does Georgia compare to some other places, and what could Georgia perhaps do better? And again, with the eye on the Secretary of State being the one who handles the improving.
I've been pleased with the service. I'm a licensed engineer in 30 different states, and I've worked with other boards, obviously. I've always got my renewal quickly in Georgia, so I've not had any issues with that. Florida, from the standpoint of a contractor's licensing, is much more rigorous than Georgia's. The issue that I would say with Georgia is we now have a contractor's licensing board, but it has no teeth. And if we're not going to have any teeth, then why do we have it? Now, the reason we did decide that we're going to license general contractors is we didn't want buildings falling down on people's ears. We didn't want people to have a deck that would fall down during a party. So there is a public interest purpose. But if you're going to do that, then you better put some teeth into it to make sure all your contractors are licensed and you're getting high quality service, or you shouldn't have the board in the first place. Then the other important issue from so many of the professions is really having reciprocity with the other states, so that if you do get relocated or decide to move, or you have a project or for some reason in another state, that you can actually then practice in another state. And that's very important to be able to do that quickly.
Senator McCoon.
Well, I think when you look at how we stack up, you've got to ask yourselves, what are the licensed professions doing? And in my time in the legislature, the pharmacy board got a bill passed to move out from under the Secretary of State's office. I carried the legislation in the Senate to move the dental board out from under the Secretary of State's office. And some of that does have to do with resources, and we've been talking about that a lot tonight, and we need to address that by constitutionally dedicating those funds. But we also need to do it through better communication, I think, with the boards themselves, and making sure we're in touch with the associations, and making sure that we are proceeding in a way that makes the system work. I spoke to a funeral director in Macon a couple of months ago who didn't get a renewal notice, a reminder notice, and failed to renew in a timely fashion. As a result, he wound up having to apply for his license all over again at a cost of over $20,000 to his business. So we need to be looking at those processes to make sure those kinds of issues don't recur.
Representative Brockway.
Yeah, this is, as I mentioned earlier, we've gone from an economy where approximately 5% of people worked in professions that need professional licenses to one where now 25% to 30% need professional licenses. During my time in the legislature, I can think of several bills that passed to require new professional licenses, lactation consultants, medical device sellers, several of these that I voted against all of them because the more we require more professions to get professional licenses, the harder we make it for people to lift themselves out of poverty. There's an entity in state government that's supposed to be looking at this, and it's not doing its job. It's called the Georgia Occupational Regulatory Review Council. And I called them up and I asked them, where can I find the reports where they're doing their job? And they're not doing them. So I dropped a resolution. We're going to have a hearing on it in the House next Wednesday to embarrass them into doing their jobs and following the law and make sure we're regulating these industries properly, not too much, but properly, so that people can get to work in Georgia.
And Mayor Belle.
I've mentioned it already several times tonight. Secretary of State is still a hat-in-hand position. So the 41 boards that the Secretary of State's office oversees are creations of the legislature. The appointees to those boards are appointed by the governor. And so the Secretary of State is in a position of simply just managing the operations of the board. What I want to see is not only an opportunity to work with the legislature to help policy move forward. I think the best idea is the reciprocity situation, especially for our veterans and for our spouses of veterans, that we can honor the licensing, professional licensing requirements that they have in other states, that we can honor those in Georgia and help our heroes.
Start with you on this one, Senator McCoon. What are some of the things, and I know the internet is I gather the new thing, all the kids are into it now. We're using it in any number of ways, and I'm sure business licensing is one of those. What are some other things we can do in terms of technology, whether it's some new app, something nobody's even thought of yet? What's around the corner, or what might be around the corner? What would be the gleam in your eye for a way to enhance our licensing process technologically?
Well, I mean, frankly, from a technological point of view, that's not really where I see the biggest problem. I mean, I think the biggest problem is where we've allowed layers of red tape to be created by sort of incumbents to keep other people out. A cosmetology license holder in our state on average spends 350 days in training before they get their license. An EMT license holder, somebody who's trained to give life-saving aid in the event of a medical emergency, on average gets 31 days of training before they have their license. I just don't believe that it takes 10 times the training for a license to cut and color hair and do nails as it does to render life-saving aid. And so we need to do some work. Why are we licensing librarians? What public health or public safety interest is there? So from a technology standpoint, I don't have a whole lot to mention there, but I do think there's some cutting of red tape that needs to be done.
Representative Raffensperger.
I don't believe that really technology, the biggest issue we had is we had an updated portal on the Secretary of State's website that was taken down. It was working, and then a new one was put in place, and we just had all sorts of time issues and other technical issues of just being able to sign up. They've worked through those bugs. I think really it's a continuous process improvement of the Secretary of State's website to be number one, and we just need to continue to work on that. Don't pull down what we have, just continue to make progressive improvements on it so that you get your answer quicker.
Mayor Belle.
Well, technology, it's one tool in the toolbox, but I think the most important aspect to bring to the table here is really the experience and the vision and the ability to lead leaders. And that's really what's going to make it different for any organization, whether it's a city, whether it's a Secretary of State's office. So if you want to improve the opportunities for Georgians, specifically as it relates to our licensing boards and opportunities, the only way to get that done is to lead beyond the authority and the resources of that office. Where technology can come in, fantastic, but it is a tool in the toolbox.
And Representative Brockway.
Yeah, I think Secretary Brian Kemp has done a great job up to now. Many of the licensing boards you can apply and reapply for the license online. Those that aren't, we need to bring that up. Another quick thing to mention is some of the gentlemen mentioned reciprocity. The governor of South Dakota is introducing a state compact that would allow states to join that compact. So the moment you move from South Dakota to Georgia, you're given a provisional professional license until you can meet the standards here in Georgia. We need to continue to work on things like that. But the bottom line is this. as I mentioned, I'm a nerd. One of my favorite classes when I was in college, I studied management science. One of my favorite classes was queuing theory. That's where we sit around and figure out how to make lines shorter. And that's really what this is about. How can we apply that nerdy technology to improve the processes? If you're not moving forward, you're falling behind. Secretary Kemp has done a great job, I think, on this count, but we need to continue to push forward and be constantly improving.
You know, as you were framing that answer, I was thinking back to the question, and I looked around the room. I made a crack about the internet and it being a new thing. Guys, look at this audience. Half of this audience, probably more than half of this audience, has no frame of reference for a world in which the internet did not exist. Neither here nor there, I suppose, on one level, but very much here and there on another. That's the world that these young people have grown up in. They have no sense of life without it. Probably a significant number of people in this room cannot recall or have any working frame of reference for life without a smartphone and apps. So by way of framing that and turning that into a question, and we'll start with you, Mr. Nerd, Representative Brockway, this is going to be, and this is the reason they're here tonight, this is going to be a large portion of your constituency. It is now, as a member of the Georgia House of Representatives would be, were you elected to the office you're seeking here as Secretary of State. I can't think of a better way to ask the question than this. How are you going to keep up with these guys?
Well, we're going to hire them and put them to work. No, look, you're exactly right. The world that I grew up in, when I went to Georgia Tech, the internet was just starting, and I worked on an old, there were computer labs. We didn't walk around with computers. There were computer labs, and we had this old Mac 2, and I thought it was the coolest thing I'd ever seen in my life. But yeah, the technology has changed so rapidly, and that's part of the problem, part of the challenge being in government. What's coming next, and what roadblocks are there in the laws that are blocking that? We've seen that in the legislature with Uber, with drones, with Tesla and electric cars. These new technologies are coming, and what are we doing to prepare for that? And when it relates to voting machines, for example, yes, we need to take a hard look, and we need to be buying machines for what we need right now, and then we need to immediately start thinking about what is voting going to look like 10 years from now when the machines we purchase are outdated. And so we've got to be thinking about that. Government doesn't often think about the future, but that's what we've got to do in the Secretary of State's office.
Mayor Belle Isle, you have described your city, I believe, as Georgia's technology city. The same question.
Well, when we set out for Alpharetta to be the best at what we do best, which is technology, I looked to my left on council and I looked to my right. And what I recognized is I had some great citizens beside me. I had an insurance agent, a financial planner, another attorney, an engineer. Nobody knew anything about technology. And the answer for us was to engage the experience and expertise of those who are running technology companies in our city to help us chart a path forward, and not only chart a path forward, but to roll up their sleeves and help us get there. You know, they say that, and I'm an attorney, they say that an attorney that represents himself has a fool for a client. If you're going to be a good Secretary of State, you're going to have to engage the expertise of others.
Representative Raffensperger.
We'll probably have to look at, and probably will look at, with outside providers that have advanced technology. You think about now your walk list are on an iPhone whenever you're going canvassing door to door, running for elections. So what could we actually, put on from the Secretary of State's office on an iPhone so that people could access that would be valuable to them, something that they'd actually use. And there probably are developers out there right now developing that. I just haven't researched those yet, but that'd be a great point and something we should look into.
And finally, Senator McCoon.
Well, I think you have
Please
to,
don't ask me the question because I've already forgotten.
I think you have to meet people where they are, and so I think leveraging technology to be able to do that. I mean, obviously we have a great crowd here tonight, but you're also live streaming this event because there are a lot of people, they live on the internet. That's where you're going to be able to engage them. And so I think the next Secretary of State needs to take advantage of that. As a state legislator, that's something that's been important to me up until this year. If you wanted to see a committee meeting of the Georgia State Senate, you had to drive to downtown Atlanta and come to the Capitol. We finally, after last year when I started using a very sophisticated piece of technology, my iPhone, to stream committee meetings, we finally got the money in the budget to do that, and we're streaming those meetings this year. So I think leveraging technology to meet people where they are and make them aware that this is their government and we want them to engage, we want their input, I think that's what we need, not just from the Secretary of State, but from all of our elected leaders.
I begin to wind things down for the evening. One more question, and then we'll get to closing statements. And again, point of order here as the benevolent dictator for the evening. I'll give them 2 minutes, if you will, Cecilia, to answer this final question, and then we'll get to closing statements, also 2 minutes there. We have mentioned his name a few times tonight. He's come up. He's the incumbent. He is Secretary of State Brian Kemp from right here in Athens, and as we know, is leaving that office to run for governor. It's an open seat, which is why perhaps several of you have decided to run for it. A two-part question, and let's talk about Brian Kemp behind his back for a couple of minutes here. Something you think he has done well as Secretary of State, and I'll ask the second part generously, some area in which you might look to improve upon or build on something he has done. Let's start with you, Senator McCoon.
Well, what he's done well, the first thing that comes to my mind is the SEC primary. That was a great example of leadership, bringing states in the southeastern part of the country together to really allow this region to have a tremendous influence on the presidential nomination process in 2016. I think he deserves great kudos for that. An area of opportunity, you've heard it spoken about a lot tonight. Secretary Kemp has had very little control over the financial resources of his office. And I think when it comes to the licensing piece, the way that we resolve that is by allowing Georgia voters to go to the ballot and constitutionally dedicate the funds being paid by these licensed professionals to be regulated. And I think that somebody who's been in the legislature, who's had experience moving legislation that is sometimes difficult to do, as I have. We didn't have any restriction on lobbyist giving in 2011 when I entered the legislature. It took 3 years to do it, but we got it done. That's a great opportunity because if we can get those funds dedicated, we can really resolve a lot of these issues about moving government out of the way and connecting people to the dignity of honest, hard work.
Representative Raffensperger.
I think the two issues that stand out most to me are obviously the SEC primary, because you brought all the states together and it put us on the roadmap. And then number two is all during the last several years, the Obama administration, their Justice Department kept on fighting us, and he fought back very quickly, very vigorously. And I think that's very important. We need an aggressive Secretary of State that's actually going to push the issue, not back down, and keep on fighting. And I think he's done a good job with that. And we prevailed every time that we fought, to have our election laws upheld.
Those are areas in which you think he did a good job. Where did he screw up, if anywhere?
Well, we all probably mess up from time to time. I've been a business owner for over 30 years, and people get second-guessed. And it's a tough job that he has, and it's been under-resourced. And I appreciate the job he's done. He's done it faithfully.
Mayor Bell-Lau.
Yeah, I think he's done a good job of holding together what is essentially an agency that has shoestring and scotch tape holding it together. If you've ever been in some of the Secretary of State offices, either Sloppy Floyd building or down in Macon, it's certainly not the Ritz. The lighting is dim, files are stacked. The expedite fees that they had to charge for filing of corporations has been kind of a gap filler just to make the revenue work. So I think he's done a good job with the limited resources that he has. As to what he could do better, I like Brian Kemp quite a bit. And having not stood in his shoes yet, I'm not prepared to cast criticism, but I think everything can be improved. I think leadership is something that needs to be added to this office.
And Representative Brockway.
Yeah, during my time in the legislature, I hear this repeatedly from colleagues. If they ever have a question that the Secretary of State's office can answer, he and his staff are Johnny on the spot, and they answer that question very effectively. As I've gone out and campaigned, what's really impressed me, and that something that I think that Brian Kemp has done a fantastic job on, is as I travel the state, I inevitably bump into community leaders, and almost to a person, they tell me how Brian Kemp, when he drives through their town, he stops, he meets with them, he meets mayors, he meets city councilmen, he meets county commissioners, he meets with all sorts of folks. And he has built these very strong relationships, and they feel like they're friends with him. And he's got friends all over the state. And so that has very much impressed me, and it's something that I hope, if the Lord allows and the voters of Georgia elect me, that I would want to continue to do, is that personal touch that I think that he's exhibited in the office. For criticisms, he's been, during this, as others have mentioned, during his term, he's faced a lot of challenges. the budgets have been cut, and he's had to try to work to fill those budgets. He gets sued every other day by somebody who's taking shots at how he's done his job, and I'll reserve judgment on that until I get in there.
Fair enough. Closing statements now. And before we get to closing statements, any number of people to thank this evening. I'm always reluctant to start thanking people because I always forget and omit, but I think I've jotted down a somewhat comprehensive list. First, the crew from our station here, Steve and Will, Logan and Abby back at the studios, Josh, our promotions and marketing director, Ethan, the University of Georgia College Republicans here, Ethan Pender and those folks, a wonderful organization, well put together. Thanks to all of you. 2 minutes for closing statements. Thank you to Cecilia, our timekeeper this evening as well. 2 minutes for closing statements. We will begin with Representative Brad Raffensperger.
Thank you for hosting this tonight. I'm running to make sure that only American citizens can vote in our elections, to make sure that Georgia is a great place to find a job and also a great place to build a business. I've been a business owner for about 35 years now, since 1987, and we've worked in over 35 different states. Right now I'm pushing it, probably about 200 folks on payroll. So I know what it takes to run a complex organization like the Secretary of State's office. I'll put the effort into it, I'll stick to it, and I'll have success. I'm asking for your vote. Thank you.
Senator Josh McCoon.
At the opening, I mentioned 2 questions you need to consider tonight. And the first question is, who is going to be best suited to defeat John Barrow in the November election? I know people in Athens know who John Barrow is. He's been a professional politician for decades. He's been able to win in districts designed to elect Republicans. There will be millions of dollars flowing in from New York and Los Angeles to try to elect John Barrow. We need our A-team on the field. We need somebody who can clearly communicate this message that you've been hearing tonight about making Georgia the fastest state in the nation to get a job and the toughest state in the nation to cast an illegal vote. But you also need somebody who's going to be able to prosecute the case against John Barrow and talk about his votes for Nancy Pelosi for Speaker, his 85% voting record with President Obama while he was in Congress. He will be the most prominent Democrat on the statewide ballot in November. We cannot sleepwalk through this election. And so you need somebody that can do that. But you need somebody in November of 2020, that was the second question, when Donald Trump's on the ballot for re-election, who's going to be able to stand strong and firm for the integrity of our electoral process. And I would submit to you that a lawyer who's practiced election law, who understands ballot access issues and other issues around election law, is vitally important. But it's also important to have somebody who's not going to back down. And I invite you to look at my 7, almost 8 years now in the legislature. Look at my record. Look at what we've done on the issues I've been involved with. And you'll find what I tell you is what I'm going to do. And that's what you need. The best indicator of future performance is prior conduct. So I, too, am asking for your vote on May 22nd, Josh McCoon for Secretary of State, to make Georgia the fastest state in the nation to get a job and the toughest state in the nation to cast an illegal vote. Thank you.
Representative Buzz Brockway.
Again, Tim, thank you very much for hosting this and asking a lot of great questions. And again, thank you to all of you for taking time out of your busy schedule to be here. You could be home binge watching whatever the latest Netflix show is or whatever, but which I'll probably be doing later tonight. But thank you again for being here, and thank you for the College Republicans for hosting this. You made me feel very welcome in Athens, which doesn't happen to me very often, but thank you. This is a very important election. We do need to, as a party, put our best team forward. You need a candidate who can unite all factions of the Republican Party, who people look at and say, I have support in my campaign from folks from all across the Republican political spectrum, from the most conservative members of the House to just flat-out rhinos, just to put it bluntly. But I've got support from all these people because they know that when I get into the Secretary of State's office job, I'm going to work hard and I'm going to do the right things for the people of Georgia. Listen, my commitment to you people and the people of Georgia is this. A lot of folks look at Secretary of State's office as a launching pad to some other office. I look at the Secretary of State's job and I say, I want to do that job. And I want to stay in that office as long as the Lord allows and the people elect me until I accomplish the goals I have set, to make sure that we have the best election system in the United States of America, that we're not just considered the best state to do business in, but we're considered the easiest state to do business in. And the last thing I'll say to you is I'll leave you with this. One of my favorite movies is the movie Braveheart. There's a great scene in that movie that I think expresses a big problem we have in our politics today. William Wallace looks at the Scottish nobles and he says to them that you think the people exist to provide you with a position, but I think your position exists to provide people with freedom. At the end of the day, the office of Secretary of State, just like every other office, was created by our Constitution to protect your freedom. And that's what I'm going to do if I'm Secretary of State. My name again is Buzz Brockway, and I would love to have your vote on May 22nd.
And Mayor David Belle Isle.
Well, we will not beat John Barrow if all we do is focus on the issues that we discussed tonight. With the mayor's office and with a lot of offices, there's two sides of the job. As mayor, there's the direct responsibilities of public safety, of engineering, parks and rec. That's fantastic. But if that's all you do, you don't bring your organization forward. As your next Secretary of State, yeah, there's the direct responsibilities that we talked about tonight, and they're important. But you also need to be able to cast a vision and lead leaders to make a better Georgia. And so what I want to do is not simply make a better Secretary of State's office for Georgia. What I want to do is make a better Georgia through the Secretary of State's office. And the way we do that, it's the same way you run a city. You have to be the best at what we do best. In Georgia, it's technology, it's agriculture, it's logistics. I want to apply the same business model that has worked and has been widely successful in Alpharetta across the state of Georgia so that we provide opportunities for every Georgian everywhere. Yes, there is the administrative side of this office, but there is also a leadership side of this office. We haven't touched on it tonight, but the only way we're going to beat Mr. Barrow is by having a compelling vision that helps every single Georgian, not simply sticking to the administrative side of this agency. David Belle Isle, I want to earn your support for Secretary of State. Thank you tonight. Go Dogs, glory, glory to old Georgia.